The morning light fell in thin, golden slices across the dry expanse of the ranch, brushing the dust with a pale warmth. Jeremiah Kane moved along the perimeter fence, his boots stirring small clouds of ochre earth with every step. His hands rested lightly on the worn leather of his sidearm, a habitual gesture more for comfort than immediate need. The wind carried scents of scorched grass and pine sap, and somewhere in the distance, a drone's low hum betrayed its patrol path along the valley ridge. The ranch, isolated and forgotten by most maps, had always been his domain, but today it felt like a fragile bubble against a world tilting toward chaos. He didn't see her at first. The girl's figure hung limply from a twisted branch of a gnarled mesquite, a stark silhouette against the early sun. The wooden sign she bore swung slightly, creaking in the breeze. "White man, don't forgive." The word struck him like a rifle shot, more than the sight of the girl herself. Her body was slight, her limbs trembling even as she dangled, and her eyes wide, alert, fearful, fixed on him with a mixture of pleading and defiance. Jeremiah's chest tightened. Years of handling insurgents, smugglers, and the occasional desperate refugee had taught him how to mask his instincts, but this was raw, personal. An unervingly immediate dot, he approached slowly, calculating each step. The terrain was uneven, littered with mesquite roots and loose stones. Every movement had to be deliberate. A misstep could trigger a fall for her, or worse, set off some hidden trap. Jeremiah's experience in tactical reconnaissance, what few had called the art of asymmetrical survival, kicked in. He scanned the perimeter for hidden observers, sensors, tripwires, the subtle glint of optics tucked among the trees. Nothing moved, nothing twitched. The valley seemed empty, but silence could be deceptive. Her breathing was shallow. Jeremiah crouched a few meters away, keeping his voice low. "I'm not here to hurt you. Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated, eyes darting to the horizon, as if expecting an attack from every ridge. Finally, her voice, soft but firm, cut the air. "I'm Naili." The name was short, sharp, carrying a rhythm that felt both ancient and resolute. Jeremiah noted it mentally, committing it to memory as though it could anchor him in the storm to come. He surveyed her situation. The rope looped around her wrists, and the branch high above was fraying, bark splintered and weathered. He needed a plan. Improvisation was necessary. No helicopter extraction, no armored convoy could reach her without alerting potential assailants. He had to rely on what he knew: terrain, timing, and precision. Using a nearby fallen log as a step, he carefully reached the knot holding her hands. It was twisted, crude, but functional. The type of rigging someone desperate or untrained would use. No sophisticated knots. No hidden mechanisms dot as he worked. The sun climbed higher, shadows shrinking, the air growing warmer. Sweat prickled his forehead. His communicator crackled to life, and he raised a finger to halt any potential dialogue. The voice of Captain Annika Voss, sharp and deliberate, came through. "Jeremiah status." "Situation critical," he replied quietly. "Female, early teens, hanging from a mesquite." Sign reads, "White man don't forgive." No immediate threat detected, but rigging is improvised. "I'm assessing extraction options." "Understood." "Sensors on the ridge show movement," Voss warned. "Could be drones, could be scouts. Terrain masking is partial, you're exposed." Jeremiah swallowed. "Copy. Maintaining low profile. Approach from South Ridge if I have to move her off-site." Voss paused, then said, "Keep comms open. Our extraction is 30 minutes out. Don't engage unless unavoidable." He ended the channel and refocused. His hands worked quickly but carefully to untangle the ropes. Nellie's limbs twitched, reflexive tension that made the process tricky. A slip could fracture her wrist or worse. He whispered calmingly, almost free, "Stay still." At last the rope yielded. He lowered her gently onto the log, then onto the soft sand beneath. Her small body sagged, exhausted but alive. Jeremiah exhaled, scanning the surrounding scrub. Movement in the distance caught his eye, a faint shimmer near the ridge, optical sensors reflecting the sun in microbursts. He had known this would happen. Rescuing her could not go unnoticed. The opposing force, whoever they were, had chosen this ground for visibility and intimidation. Niley shivered. Jeremiah wrapped her in his jacket, noting the deep cuts and bruises along her forearms, signs of previous struggle, rough handling, perhaps intimidation. Her eyes darted again toward the horizon, suspicion etching every line of her small face. "Why are you here?" he asked softly, trying to establish trust. "Who left the sign?" Her lips trembled. They're called the Red Circle. They hunt anyone who helps our people. They said. Her voice faltered. They said no forgiveness. That's why I'm here. Jeremiah's mind raced. The Red Circle, he had heard of them, whispers in tactical channels about their ruthless enforcement of territory and fear. Organized, small, elusive, deadly in asymmetrical warfare. No uniforms, no standard command structure, making conventional engagement nearly impossible. Their threats were psychological weapons as much as tactical ones. Movement on the ridge. Intensified shadows shifting against the rock face. Silent footfalls, almost invisible. He scanned his gear. The kinetic stabilizer on his rifle hummed, a ready signal. A compact drone was in his pack, capable of jamming small comms and relaying infrared images. He activated it silently, sending it over the ridge. The drone's feed flickered onto his visor, revealing a dozen figures moving with predatory patience, rifles slung, optics trained. The Red Circle scouts had come to ensure their message was delivered and that the girl remained a pawn. Jeremiah's heart thrummed, but he kept his voice calm. "Voss," scouts confirmed. 12 to 15 on ridge. They're armed, moving in loose formation. No direct engagement yet? Her small hand clutched his sleeve. "They'll come back," Nayeli whispered, eyes wide. "They always come back." He nodded. "I know. But we'll make them regret it." The words sounded more like a promise to himself than to her. His mind clicked into operational mode. Open engagement was suicide. He needed a counterintuitive approach. The ridge's line of sight advantage was obvious, but perhaps it could be used against them. If he could lure them closer into a narrow canyon, their numbers would be nullified by the terrain. He motioned for Nayeli to stay low. "I need you to trust me for a few minutes." "Can you do that?" Her eyes searched his face for hesitation, but found none. She nodded slowly, using the natural folds of the land. Jeremiah moved with precision, placing small decoy markers, dirt piles, and disturbed brush to suggest movement away from the true extraction path. Every step was calculated, each sound considered. The Red Circle scouts had trained eyes, but they were human, prone to pattern recognition. If he could exploit that, he might buy the precious time needed as he maneuvered. He recalled his last reconnaissance mission, where an enemy unit had fallen into a cleverly baited crossfire, an exploit of overconfidence. The memory was sharp, painful in its clarity. He could replicate some of that principle here. The ridge, the canyon, the sparse mesquite groves, they were variables in his favor if he acted. Quickly and decisively, the first skirmish erupted without warning. A sniper's pulse echoed a precise shot meant to intimidate. Not to wound, but the dirt kicked up dangerously close to Nayeli. He yanked her low, flattening them behind a boulder. The Red Circle scouts had recognized their prey and had begun probing patterns, testing the ground. Jeremiah's heart pounded in rhythm with the girl's terrified breaths. He counted their approach, marking gaps in their formation. Tactical ingenuity demanded a feint. Using a flare launcher from his belt, he ignited a controlled burst to the north, creating a visual misdirection. One scout fired reflexively, drawing attention, while Jeremiah led Nayeli through the concealed side path he had scouted minutes earlier. Every meter gained was a gamble, every heartbeat an unspoken bet against failure. Halfway down the path, a drone's shadow flickered overhead, but it was one of theirs, silent, almost invisible, ensuring no stray scout detected them. Communication latency forced reliance on gestures and prearranged signals, yet coordination remained flawless. A wrong move could trigger panic and expose their position dot as the canyon narrowed. The scouts on the ridge realized the bait. Their formation faltered, the discipline of numbers disrupted by terrain disadvantage. Jeremiah's pulse was steady, each step a meditation and controlled aggression. He signaled Nayeli to remain low, whispering instructions for cover and balance. They reached a natural alcove, a pocket of shadow and overhang, just as the first rain of dust and gravel from the startled scouts cascaded down from the ridge. Jeremiah peered out, calculating angles, plotting the next move. A counterintuitive weakness had revealed itself. The scouts' optics were optimized for mid-distance targeting, not the extreme angles the canyon forced. He could exploit it, but the cost would be high if misjudged. Jeremiah crouched, bracing Nayeli against his side. "We move fast. No hesitation. Follow my lead." The girl's grip tightened on his forearm, resolve hardening in the face of fear. He exhaled slowly, aware of the stakes. The red circle would return, stronger, more prepared. The first encounter had revealed vulnerabilities, but it had also announced their presence. Survival depended on improvisation, ingenuity, and relentless determination. One wrong step, and the day would. And yet Jeremiah smiled faintly, a predator's grin laced with hope and defiance. They were not done yet. Not by a long shot. The first test had been survived, but the real fight, the one that would demand every ounce of his tactical mind, every instinct honed by years in hostile lands, was just beginning. The girl's eyes met his, wide with terror but flickering with trust, and he knew they had to move. A sudden flash of movement above made him freeze. Something or someone was descending along the ridge, exploiting the canyon's shadow. Jeremiah's mind raced, plotting countermeasures even as the gravity of the moment sank in. They were exposed. The red circle had adapted faster than anticipated, and in the shifting light of the canyon, the first true gambit of the day was about to unfold. The air tightened, thick with anticipation and dust. Jeremiah clenched his jaw, his senses alive, every fiber of his being ready. Nayeli shifted beside him, silent but alert. The enemy was near, and the real test, the one that would demand courage, precision, an unyielding resolve, was seconds away. He drew a slow, deliberate breath, and in that heartbeat of quiet before chaos, Jeremiah Kane made a vow they would survive. Not by luck, not by chance, but by craft, courage, and calculation. The red circle would learn, in the hardest way possible, that the man who protected what mattered would not be broken. And then the first shot rang out, echoing off stone and mesquite, marking the start of a battle that would push them both to the edge. Jeremiah felt the shockwave of the first shot reverberate through his chest more than the noise itself. Dust plumes erupted around the canyon's jagged walls, scattering pebbles and loose soil in an almost cinematic spray. He dragged Nayeli lower behind the boulder, her small body trembling but silent now, ears pressed to his chest. The red circle had learned quickly, their initial hesitation replaced by an aggressive push down the canyon slopes. He could see the faint glint of optics scanning every shadow, measuring every contour of terrain, calculating the kill zones as they advanced. The landscape worked against him. Narrow, winding, and littered with sudden drop-offs, the canyon limited his options for movement and engagement. But he had noticed the pattern in their scouts' movement: tight formations, Rigid scanning sequences, predictable reliance on line-of-sight detection. That predictability was an exploitable weakness, if he could manipulate it correctly. "Listen," he whispered to Nayeli, his hand firm on her shoulder. "We'll move, but you follow exactly. One misstep and we're exposed. Understand?" She nodded, her jaw tight, eyes wide but alert. He noted her resolve. It was fragile but real. Even the young could learn strategy under pressure, he reminded himself. Survival demanded it. He peered toward the approaching scouts. Using the canyon's shadows and the overhangs, he signaled for Nayeli to stay down as he shifted to a higher ledge. From this vantage, he could observe the full sweep of the red circle's advance. He counted 17 now, 2 more than the initial recon had indicated. They were armed with modular rifles, optical enhancers, and light comm units sophisticated. Yet their formation made them vulnerable to close-terrain constriction. Jeremiah needed to create a bottleneck. A few well-placed explosive charges were out of reach. The canyon's heat had destabilized most of his small arsenal. Improvisation would be crucial. He pulled a coil of thin wire from his pack, along with small metallic sensors, and set about creating a tripwire that would serve as a visual and auditory distraction. Nothing lethal, just enough to trigger reflexive scanning, breaking the scout's rhythm. The first scout crossed the wire. A soft snap, almost imperceptible, caused him to jerk and glance sideways. The chain reaction began. 1, 2, then 3 scouts looked up, disrupting their pattern. Jeremiah counted milliseconds and lunged, hurling a small rock toward the canyon wall, producing a loud metallic echo. It was enough. The scouts hesitated, confused, distracted by the auditory cue. "Move," he whispered. Nayeli followed, stepping carefully over uneven ground, muscles tensing with each step. They skirted the canyon edge, leveraging rocks and shadows as cover. The scouts' initial numerical advantage had been neutralized by terrain manipulation and careful timing. Still, this was only phase 1. Survival was measured in minutes, not the distance gained. A sudden flare of dust and movement on the far ridge caught his attention. A drone, small, quadrotor, emitted the faint hum of surveillance. The red circle had brought reinforcements, anticipating their escape route. Jeremiah cursed under his breath. The canyon was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a funnel toward an inevitable confrontation. He had to act fast. He ducked into a shallow overhang, pulling Nayeli down behind a pile of rocks. "We need a secondary path," he muttered, scanning the rough map etched in his mind from previous patrols. There was a dry wash that angled off at nearly 90 degrees from the main canyon, floor less traveled, more treacherous, but potentially unseen by the scout's optics. "Can you climb?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing at the slope that rose steeply before them. Jeremiah's eyes softened. "If you can, we can outmaneuver them. If not..." His voice trailed, but the implication was clear. Stagnation meant death. She swallowed, nodded, and clutched his arm. Together, they scaled the wash, careful with every foothold. Loose rock gave way under her weight, sending a cascade of pebbles down the canyon. Jeremiah winced, but the scouts below only glanced momentarily. Distracted by their own scanning protocols, as they climbed, his comms crackled. Annika Voss's voice terse filled the earpiece. "Jeremiah, what's your vector?" "Extraction is delayed. Hostile numbers increasing. Secondary canyon wash. Moving north. Terrain cover optimal but unstable. Scouts on ridge have partial line of sight." "Suggest intercept if possible," he replied, voice low but precise. "Understood." "Data relay online. I'm patching in drone feed watch for thermal shadows." "They're adaptive," she warned. He activated the feed. Overlaying the infrared view atop his visor HUD, Thermal signatures confirmed 17 scouts moving methodically, plus one hovering drone monitoring the canyon mouth. Their movement was aggressive, yet their linearity revealed the opening he needed. The calculated risk. If he could time the descent along the wash and use gravity to his advantage, he might reach a lateral ridge beyond the scouts before detection. The descent was a technical ballet. Jeremiah anchored each foothold, testing loose soil and projecting weight precisely. Mayeli struggled initially, her small hands slipping, scraping against rough stone. But he coached her, every instruction deliberate, every correction precise. The canyon walls echoed their subtle movements, creating an ambient soundscape that masked their descent. Suddenly, a distant shout of command cut the air. One of the scouts had caught a glimpse of movement. Jeremiah froze, calculating the distance, angle, and response time. He needed to draw attention without engagement. Using a small reflective piece of metal, he angled the sun's rays toward a distant boulder, producing a flash. The scouts reacted instinctively, their line of sight broken, their formation disrupted. It was enough to continue the descent. Reaching the lateral ridge, Jeremiah allowed himself a fraction of relief. Below, the scouts were reorganizing, clearly trying to regain composure and assess the terrain. Above, the drone buzzed, scanning methodically. The ridge offered concealment, natural camouflaging terrain, and a vantage point for observation. He crouched, letting Nayeli rest, noting her exhaustion. Her breathing was ragged, her small frame trembling, but the determination in her eyes mirrored his own. He reviewed the situation in his mind, running through logistics. Supplies were minimal water rationed, minimal ammunition, limited sensors, but the terrain offered asymmetric advantage. The scouts could not overwhelm him here without exposing themselves to predictable countermeasures. The key would be patience, timing, and a willingness to exploit every psychological and tactical gap. Jeremiah scanned for hazards, unstable rock, potential ambush sites, or sudden drops. His mind ticked through contingencies, improvised traps, noise-based distractions, and the eventual extraction point remote, obscured by terrain folds and reachable only by calculated maneuvering. Every variable was noted, every risk catalogued. The night fell early, canyon shadows stretching like fingers across the walls. Jeremiah set up a small concealed thermal diffuser to obscure their heat signatures. Mayeli huddled beside him, shivering, and he placed his jacket over her shoulders again. Hunger and fatigue were mounting, but sleep was a liability. The red circle had shown adaptive tendencies, overnight engagement was a possibility, and he could not underestimate their ingenuity. Hours passed. They remained in near silence, broken only by distant chatter from Boss and the occasional wind rustle. Jeremiah reviewed their options, weighing extraction timing versus risk of scout reinforcements. Every scenario demanded improvisation, but the objective was clear. Keep Nayeli alive, avoid engagement until leverage was maximized, and use terrain advantage to neutralize numerical inferiority. Then came the first breakthrough. One of the scouts' drones, operating on predictable hover patterns, revealed a momentary blind spot in thermal coverage, a gap caused by canyon curvature and solar heat dissipation. Jeremiah seized the observation, planning a covert movement to the next ridge segment. Every movement now required synchronization, physics, and psychological insight. Sudden sound. He whispered to Nayeli, "We move on 3. 1, 2, 3. They shifted silently, the canyon walls absorbing any minor sound. Dust disturbed minimally. The scouts' line of sight remained interrupted, and the drone's feed registered nothing in the new blind spot. The operation was proceeding, each calculated step buying survival time, but the red circle was adaptive. A sudden flare of light from the opposite ridge, likely a reflected optical sensor, revealed their movement. A cascade of whistles and shouted commands followed. The scouts began converging faster, more aggressively, attempting to box them in. Jeremiah felt a surge of tension, every nerve alive. He realized their initial gambit had bought time, but the enemy was recalibrating. He whispered, "Brace yourself." They've adopted faster than expected. Naomi's grip tightened, her resolve still intact, but fear evident. The canyon, which had been an ally, now threatened to become a trap. The next move would determine whether they survived the night, or whether the red circle would seize their advantage entirely. Jeremiah crouched, calculating angles, weight distribution, and optimal cover. The scouts were fast approaching, forcing him to improvise under duress. He knew this phase of the escape demanded more than agility, it required tactical intuition, exploiting the human tendencies of the enemy, and precise timing to execute a maneuver that could turn the tables. And then, as they rounded a narrow bend, Jeremiah spotted it, a small, hidden depression in the canyon floor, perfect for temporary concealment, but directly in the path of a scout patrol. The gamble was obvious, concealment risked detection, but offered a chance to disrupt the scouts' advance through misdirection. Jeremiah met Naomi's eyes, silent communication passing between them. "Trust me," he said, voice calm but firm. She nodded, and together they slipped into the shadowed hollow, heartbeats sinking in the quiet that preceded imminent confrontation. Above them, the first scout passed, oblivious. Jeremiah counted, prepared to trigger a minor collapse of loose stones to force the remaining scouts into a false perception of their location. Seconds ticked like hours. Every calculation, every instinct honed by years of field experience, culminated in this moment. Then a hand brushed his shoulder naily, tense but ready. A faint whistle from the ridge followed, unmistakably close. Jeremiah realized with a jolt the red circle had adapted faster than anticipated, and the window for clever improvisation was closing. Sense of inevitability settled over him, but so did a determination as fierce as the canyon walls. They would survive this night, but it would cost everything that, and with that, the first real engagement of improvisation and tactical ingenuity erupted, echoing through the canyon in a cacophony of dust, movement, and calculated defiance. Jeremiah's muscles burned from constant tension, as the first night in the canyon stretched into a slow, punishing dawn. Shadows had shifted, revealing new vulnerabilities in the terrain that had protected them hours before. The red circle was relentless. Their scouts had adapted, and now the rhythm of pursuit had become almost surgical. Their footfalls measured and predictable, but deadly in precision. Jeremiah understood that this engagement had transformed from a simple extraction into a full-scale tactical chess game. Every misstep could cost them their lives. From his vantage point on a jagged overhang, he observed the enemy's formation, noting how their standard patrol patterns and drone coverage created exploitable blind spots. It was a lesson in asymmetry. The red circle relied on discipline, numbers, and optical technology, but they were slow to improvise. Jeremiah's mind raced, calculating ways to turn that rigidity against them. Naomi crouched beside him, silent, eyes scanning as he taught her the subtle art of observation, how to read the terrain, anticipate movement, and remain unseen. She mimicked his gestures carefully, absorbing every detail. Annika Voss's voice crackled through the calm, urgency slicing through the static. "Jeremiah, our intercept teams are moving, but enemy reinforcements are en route. Your time window is closing. Intel suggests command nodes along the northern ridge. Could be an opportunity to disrupt their network." Jeremiah frowned, weighing the options. Disrupting the command nodes would slow the red circle's operational tempo, but it required leaving the natural cover of the canyon and exposing themselves to open terrain. It was a risk, but one that could turn the tide. He nodded, even though Voss could not see him. Understood. We'll move toward the ridge, using diversion tactics to cover our approach. Mayeli, you're with me every step, stay close, do exactly as I say. The ascent began. The canyon narrowed in places, forcing them to climb over jagged boulders and navigate precarious ledges. Every movement was measured. A slip could mean death. Jaramir's tactical mind orchestrated their path like a symphony of precision and risk. Loose rock piles were manipulated to create minor avalanches, forcing scouts to reposition, buying seconds that felt like lifetimes. Mayli's small hand scraped against stone as she climbed, her face pale but determined. Each breath, each cautious step reinforced the bond forming between them, one forged in necessity. In survival, in the shared understanding that they were now inextricably linked, they reached the first outcrop near the ridge, and Jaramir paused to survey the landscape. The command nodes were visible, small clusters of equipment perched atop the rocks, wired with rudimentary but effective comm relays. Scouts patrolled in predictable loops. A single misstep in approach would trigger an alarm. Jaramir studied the nodes, calculating approach vectors and optimal distances. A railgun-mounted drone was stationed nearby, a deadly sentinel if activated. Yet, the line of sight for the drone had a narrow blind spot, caused by a small protruding boulder, exploitable flaw in their otherwise disciplined perimeter. He signaled Mayeli to stay low and began setting a series of distractions, small explosive charges, carefully timed flares, and reflective decoys. The first charge went off, a muffled pop that caused a scout to investigate. The second followed, drawing another pair of eyes away. The pattern forced the scouts to break formation. Jaramir counted heartbeats, waiting for the precise moment to advance. Timing was everything. Too early, and they risked detection. Too late, and reinforcements could arrive. They advanced along the ridge, the nodes coming closer with each deliberate step. The Red Circle's scouts reacted predictably, their linear logic betraying them. Jaramir manipulated the environment, rolling stones and shifting shadows to create false movement signals. The tension was palpable. The air seemed to vibrate with the anticipation of discovery. Mayeli mirrored his movements perfectly, every gesture coordinated, every breath synchronized as they reached the first node. Jaramir worked quickly. He dismantled the communications relay, disabling the power feed with careful precision. Sparks flew, hissing softly as the circuitry failed. The Red Circle scouts reacted too late. The node went dark, a blackout in their otherwise disciplined network. Jaramir felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge that this victory was only tactical and temporary. The scouts below were regrouping, alerted to the disruption, and the drone was circling back, adjusting to new thermal patterns. "Move to the second node," he whispered to Nayeli. Her small nod was firm. She had learned quickly adaptation under pressure was her strength, and she had internalized the principles of evasion, concealment, and timing. Together they advanced, moving in near silence, each step a study in discipline and precision as they reached the second node. However, the operation took an unexpected turn. A figure emerged from a nearby ridge, another human presence, but not one of their team. It was a Red Circle operative, moving stealthily, clearly tasked with reinforcing the nodes. Jaramir froze, calculating possibilities. Engagement would reveal their position and compromise their hard-won advantage. Retreat risked losing the momentum. Improvisation became crucial. He whispered instructions to Mayeli, signaling her to remain hidden behind a rock formation while he drew the operative's attention. Using a small flare launcher, he created a burst of light in a nearby crevice. The operative moved toward it, curiosity piqued, discipline broken by instinct. Jaramir used the moment to disable the second node, cutting wires and jamming the circuitry. Sparks erupted, the equipment failing. The operative realized the deception and began a rapid pursuit, forcing Jeremiah and Nayeli into open terrain. The canyon stretched before them, a maze of jagged rocks and narrow passes. The Red Circle operative gained ground, and Jeremiah had to make a split-second decision. Using a steep drop-off to their right, he initiated a controlled descent, using ropes and friction techniques to slow their fall. Nayeli followed, her trust absolute. Even as adrenaline surged through her veins, they landed on a narrow ledge below, hearts pounding. The operative above shouted commands, alerting other scouts, but the terrain had once again shifted the advantage. Jeremiah had anticipated such a scenario, and he guided Nayeli through a series of tight passages, exploiting blind spots in the enemy sensors. The Red Circle scouts, disciplined but predictable, faltered against unconventional terrain navigation, but the victory was short-lived. As they navigated a narrow canyon stretch, Jeremiah noticed a sudden movement to their left, a trap, long set and carefully concealed. Until they reached a vantage point overlooking a narrow valley. Below, scouts moved methodically, searching for their presence. It was here that a betrayal revealed itself. A figure, indistinct at first, emerged on the ridge, someone who should have been an ally. A field liaison from the regional command had been compromised, feeding intelligence to the Red Circle in exchange for unclear motives. Jeremiah's mind locked on the betrayal, his instincts sharpening. Trust was shattered, the game had changed, and the enemy now had a direct line to their planned movements. He motioned for Nayeli to stay low and whispered instructions. They would have to improvise escape and counterintelligence maneuvers simultaneously. Using a combination of shadow, rock cover, and carefully timed flare signals, Jeremiah created the illusion of movement in the valley below, drawing the scouts away from their true position. The liaison observed, documenting the fate, unaware that Jeremiah had already accounted for double deception through meticulous coordination. They navigated to a secondary ridge that offered potential extraction but at high risk. The scout search patterns tightened, their numbers increased, and the drone's thermal sweep forced Jeremiah to calculate rapid adjustments in pathing and speed. Every second was a calculated gamble, every step a negotiation with death. Nayeli, small but resolute, followed exactly, mirroring his movements and understanding tacit instructions. Each silent coordination, each precise motion, reinforced the bond that had grown under fire and terror. The betrayal, the unexpected obstacles, the relentless pressure all forged a crucible in which survival instincts and tactical ingenuity were tested to their absolute limits. As night approached once more, Jeremiah realized they had achieved partial success. 2 command nodes disabled, enemy formation disrupted, but the Red Circle had adapted. Scouts were converging from multiple vectors. The compromised liaison had observed their tactics, and reinforcements were imminent. The canyon, once a protective maze, now threatened to become a death trap. Jeremiah crouched beside Nayeli on the ridge, catching her breath. "We've disrupted them, but we're not safe yet," he said quietly. "The real test is coming, the point where strategy, timing, and every ounce of resolve will be pushed to the limit." He looked across the valley. The Red Circle's patrols moved with precision, drones flitted overhead, and the terrain below offered no sanctuary. Every option was constrained, every path fraught with danger. He knew that to survive, they would need more than improvisation. They would need audacity, cunning, and a willingness to exploit every psychological and physical weakness of the enemy. Above them, a faint silhouette moved along the ridge, a signal that reinforcements had arrived earlier than predicted. Jeremiah's pulse quickened, and he knew the next gambit, the raid on enemy logistics and communications, would define the outcome. Survival was no longer enough. To achieve victory, they would have to strike decisively, turning every advantage they had gained into leverage. In that moment, as the canyon darkened under the approaching night, Jeremiah understood that the battle was no longer just tactical, it was personal, moral, and unrelenting. Nayeli, eyes wide but determined, whispered, "We can do it, right?" Jeremiah clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him. "We have to. And we will." The enemy below was already mobilizing for a counterattack, unaware that every predictable move had been anticipated, every standard procedure exploited. The next stage of the engagement of high-risk raid that would expose the enemy's vulnerabilities and shift the strategic map was about to begin. And Jeremiah knew that failure was not an option. The first whistle of movement echoed across the ridge. Scouts were closing in, the drone's hum growing louder, and the compromise of their supposed ally had changed the battlefield irreversibly. Jeremiah drew in a deep breath, tightening his grip on his weapon, and prepared to lead Nayeli into the offensive gambit that would determine the fate of both of them. The night held its breath, and the canyon awaited the next storm. The plan that rippled through the ragged cum channels at first light was less a single thrust than a hand of coordinated feints, 3 vectors, each calibrated to a fraction of the enemy's expected response time. Annika Voss drew the outline on her tablet, the map a ragged scar of ridges, washes, and sensor nodes. Her finger hovered over the northern ridge where Jeremiah and Nayeli crouched in the thin scrub. To the east, pilot Malik Cortez would run a low, kinetic diversion in a battered VTOL fitted with an improvised rail disruption pod. To the west, Dr. Sarah Elin would execute an electronic warfare strike from a mobile relay, frying the red circle's mesh long enough for a strike team to infiltrate their logistics spur. The liaison's betrayal had narrowed their margin for error, but it had also revealed how the red circle centralized their comms. Hit the spine, and the body flailed. Voss's voice was economy itself when she spoke. "We cut the eyes, then crush the spine. Malik, you take the eastern vector. Sarah, we only get one window. Jeremiah, create the distraction on the ridge and hold until we can exploit the jam." If Calder, she didn't finish. The name of the compromised liaison hung in static. Everyone knew what followed. They would have to neutralize the information leak. Not by killing the traitor rules of engagement and humanitarian law complicated. A simpler revenge, but by forcing him into a corner where testimony would buy leverage. And the truth could be used. Jeremiah read the plan through the filtered feed. His hands were cramped from the night's vigil. The skin along his knuckles was abraded where a rope had cut into him. Ammunition count was pinned in the lower left of his HUD. Rifle rounds 46 120ths, pistol 7/12ths. Charges remaining 2, medpack 1, battery for comm diffuser 40%. The math was fragile. Every number a negotiation with risk. He inhaled and exhaled until he could think. Nayeli watched him, small eyes steady. She had learned deception, silence, the cadence of tactical patience in a matter of days that would have taken others months. Her throat was raw from the previous night's whispering. Her left forearm bore a half-healed gash where a net had caught her. The wound had been cleaned, but infection would be a constant ghost if the extraction delayed. Malik checked the rail disruption pod again. The device was a jury-rigged cylinder of capacitors and powdered magnetic flux plates strapped to a VTOL that had seen better days. The pod's goal was not to destroy the enemy's railgun drone. Their rail defender was an automated sentinel mounted near the nodes, but to overload its targeting. Uplink enough that it misread the horizon for 30 seconds. 30 seconds in which Sarah's signal would push through a carefully formed phantom network, feeding false telemetry and creating a thermal ghost in the valley. Malik's breath fogged the cockpit as he cinched with Voss, His ship's fuel tally was tight: 32 minutes of hover and 3 minutes of controlled dive. Engine heat signatures would be a liability. The pod's supercapacitors needed a 2-minute recharge after discharge. The plan asked for timing as precise as a heart valve. Dr. Sarah Elin had spent her life turning noise into intelligence. Soft-spoken, surgical in thought, and maddeningly impatient for clean data, she had set up a mobile e-dually relay out of a converted all-terrain rig and a tower of repurposed satellite dishes. Her kit could throw an electromagnetic fog across a small area, but it would draw power like a thirsty animal. Her battery banks were bolted into the bed of her rig. Each pulse would drain them and risk a shutdown that could strand the team mid-execution. She checked thermal maps, latencies, and the relay's thermal bloom. The red circle's mesh relied on opportunistic relays that stitched sensor packets across ridge to ridge. Cut a few stitches and the fabric pulled apart. She had one clean shot to nudge the mesh into redundancy failure. And if Jeremiah could hold the ridge long enough, the strike team could press into the logistics spur before the web rewove itself. Calder, recently compromised, frequently present, and startlingly human in his cowardice, would be the pivot. They would not storm him. They had to force him to talk. The rules of engagement they followed held depravity at bay, and Voss insisted that getting Calder's testimony alive meant legal leverage, exposing bank transactions, supply lines, the identities of those selling arms into the region. The military could follow up with targeted takedowns and legal action. It was strategic mercy. It also meant Calder had to be captured, not killed. The 3-vector operation unspooled like clockwork in the cool morning air. Jeremiah slipped from the scrub to the ridge, with Nayeli folded in the crook of his arm for short stretches, then slung over his pack as they moved through the shallowest wains. The scouts below tightened their sweeps. Jeremiah dropped a stream of reflective decoys into the canyon, little mirrors that would confound optics for a moment. It was the flicker Voss needed to start the westward pulse. Sarah's rig hummed like a living thing when she hit the trigger. Power cascaded through the arrays, and she felt the heat sink shudder. The mesh flickered. For 2 heartbeats, the red circle's nodes thought the canyon had 4 heat signatures when it had 3, then adjusted. Telemetry noise spiked, and the mesh tried to compensate. Sarah leaned forward and pushed a second modulation, corrupting the reconciliation packets that allowed nodes to reassert priority. Traffic jammed. The Sentinel railgun, which relied on precise uplink correction. That hesitation was Malik's window. He dove low over the eastern escarpment, the VTOL's rotors a distant thunder. The rail disruption pod spat a controlled burst of magnetic flux toward the Sentinel drone's uplink beacon. In the cockpit, the world narrowed to the heartbeat of the machine and the arc of the descent. The pod discharged. The railgun's targeting corrected itself in error, and its aim slid just enough that its next calibration would need manual retuning. Malik's HUD flashed a 2-minute cooldown on the capacitors. His heart kept time with the countdown. He had bought the team time, but he had also painted a brighter signature on the horizon. Below, the scouts scrambled, attempting to regain a common operating picture. They reoriented, but the mesh was staggered. Sarah watched the packet flows collapse into entropy on her screen and knew, bitterly, she had less than 3 minutes before their systems rerouted. She keyed in the phantom telemetry a synthetic temperature trail running from the canyon mouth to an old cistern near the logistics spur and let the mesh digest the lie. The scouts at I fed on the new data and moved to intercept the phantom, leaving a corridor ahead that was predictably, dangerously empty. Jeremiah felt the corridor open like a mouth. He and Nayeli sprinted the lateral ridge, crossing broken stone and scrub that slapped at his legs. They dropped into the wash under the nodes and moved with silence that came from the muscle memory of long practice. 2 charges remained in his pack. He had kept them cold, soft, willing. He remembered the sound of a railgun's coil tasting wrong metal, singing at the wrong frequency, and that memory stilled his hands. As the team descended toward the logistics spur, the unexpected happened. A figure slipped from the shadows of a collapsed storage crate Calder. He was gaunt, eyes blown wide by guilt and fear, his field thus empty of munitions but full of secrets. He looked older in the harsh light, like someone who had been kept awake too long by small betrayals. The sight of him was a gut punch for everyone who had expected to catch him off guard. He was not alone. A Red Circle lieutenant stood with him, a silent testament to the liaison's capitulation. Calder's mouth opened, closed. He was the Axis Voss had insisted on capturing, and now the Axis was moving under enemy terms. Jeremiah didn't shout. He had a plan. Calder, he said low. The name was a soft nail in a rough world. Calder's hand trembled. The lieutenant barked an order. The man's finger hovered over Calder's shoulder, and the situation threatened to become a firefight where rules meant nothing. Voss's voice, however, found calm in the static. "Hold," she said. The word traveled like a scalpel. Her team froze, and Malik dipped low to keep an eye from the east. Sarah's relay hummed with strained power. In that held breath, Calder turned toward Voss, and the lieutenant saw the pause as an opportunity to slither a hand toward his weapon. In half a second, Jeremiah acted. He hurled a microstun at the lieutenant's feet, a compact device that exploded with an electromagnetic pulse, designed to disrupt muscle control for a fraction of a second and scram his neural microstems. The lieutenant convulsed and dropped, and the weapon clattered out of reach. Malik, holding a stabilizing angle, brought his VTOL around in a show of threat that kept the rest of the scouts from converging. The situation pivoted, and Calder sagged as if a weight had been lifted. Voss moved like a shadow with authority. She advanced and cuffed Calder in a manner prompt and professional. His resistance was a single gasp. It was not a triumph. It was a man collapsing under the weight of his choices. She readied the recording apparatus, legal safeguard protocol, and spoke in a voice both sharp and measured. "You will tell us everything. We want legal leverage, not vigilantism. You understand the difference?" Calder's breath hitched. He nodded because there was nowhere else to go. The lieutenant, meanwhile, had been ejected from his position by the stun and had been isolated by Sarah's relay, which now crawled through his comm buffer, inserting a hard lock to prevent coordination. For a hard, splendid minute, it felt like leverage had been won without blood. Jeremiah tightened his jaw and watched the scouts reorganize. The mesh was recouping, and the rail sentinel's coils were humming back to life. Malik had a 2-minute window before the capacitors fully recharged, and the sentinel regained a reliable corrective stream. Sarah's banks were at 40%. Voss's extraction window was tethered to the batteries, the physical realities of heat, power draw, and human tolerance. They were threaded on a needle dot. It was then that the cost extracted itself. Malik's VTOL having taken heavy, downdraft stress and shrapnel from a previously unseen anti-air plate gave a sound like a wounded beast. He had exceeded safe parameters. Fuel lines were punctured. The hull flare showed a thermal bleed. Malik knew the ship would not survive another run. The pilot's face narrowed into a mask of grim acceptance. He radioed to Voss in a spare channel, voice clipped with fatigue. "I can clear a landing, but not both ways. If you need extraction farther out, I'll burn the last of the capacitors to create a decoy plume and guide the team. Then I'll have to set her down and scavenge to keep my crew alive." The words were economy. Duty pressed at the edges of his throat. He also added, more quietly, "If it comes down to a choice, people first, machine second." Malik's ship was a body he had loved. His choice echoed through the canyon like a declaration. Voss breathed. She was measured. Strategy was merciful when it preserved life. The team moved with a finality that belonged to those who have stared down calamity more than once. They disassembled the nearest storage crates, scrounging fuel lines and spare capacitors for Malik. Jeremiah watched every motion with the keen eye of a man who knew what things cost. He felt now the ache of accumulated injuries and attrition. He had taken fractures to the left hand earlier in an improvised rappel. It throbbed in the cold. His rounds were lower than he liked, and his charges were down to 1. Melee's gash was bleeding again under the dirt. The cost of this raid was more than feral adrenaline. They reached the logistics spur, a line of crates and stolen fuel cells stacked under a tarpaulin, the red circle's lifeblood. Sarah's relay choked off the last of the mesh's coherence. For a moment, they had the advantage. Voss moved in with 2 confiscation teams and handcuffs and legalese, setting up the rules, even in the smell of diesel and burnt metal. Calder rattled off names while a recording stack validated the claims. He spoke of a broker in a valley town, of coin transfer nodes disguised as field clinics, of a man named Ruiz who had been seen moving crates at night. Each name Cortez recorded was a needle that could unpick a sleeve of operations. Then, from the West Ridge, a sound that made the canyon itself listen, the approach of a convoy. Heavy tires, the rasp of armored plating. The Red Circle had been gifted a resource they hadn't expected outside reinforcements. Voss glanced at the lattice of gaps left open by their operation. The team had completed the mission's central objective, logistics interdiction and Calder's testimony. But the approach of reinforcements tightened the noose. Malik radioed the capacity of his engines, a single run left if he burned everything. Sarah's banks would die in 2 more modulation cycles. Jeremiah felt the calculus in his marrow. Voss did not hesitate. We hold the line here. We set the ambush for the convoy. There's time use the terrain. Brutal but calculated. She turned to Jeremiah. You and I will push the convoy's lead vehicle into the wash. Malik will create the decoy plume and draw their anti-air. Sarah, feed us ghost signatures to misplace them. We will not die here. We will trade space for certainty. The team split with the precision of hands that had rehearsed this in countless dry runs. Jeremiah positioned charges along a choke point in the wash. This was not meant to destroy the convoy, but to create a controlled collapse that would force it into the open where Malik's decoy could blind their optics. He had but 1 charge left, and the timing would be hair-thin. They waited. The first heavy vehicle crested the ridge and dropped into the wash, its undercarriage grinding. Jeremiah's nerves hummed. He watched the lead driver's eyes visible through a small lens-focused, trained human. He could have detonated and taken lives in a blink. He had orders, and he had ethics woven into those orders. He dialed the charge, and instead used it to sheave the vehicle's path Calatin stone into its track and immobilize the lead, rigged mechanically. The convoy stalled. Malik's decoy plume blossomed to the east like a smoke signal, and the reinforcements turned instinctively toward it. 2 seconds through Sarah's phantom telemetry nudged one flank, suggesting an alternate path. The convoy broke formation, trying to compensate, exposing the rear. That was when a bullet found Jeremiah's shoulder. The pain was immediate and unambiguous, red-hot. He tasted metal. The round had come from a sniper hidden in a collapsed stone pile, someone who had been playing a patient, murderous game. He grunted, half falling, the world tilting, and felt Nile's grip on his pack. Small hands clumsy but ferocious. Voss moved to cover him, returning fire, and the canyon erupted with tactical violence, less spectacle and more brutal arithmetic. Malik's VTOL, burning the last of its capacitors, screamed overhead and then slumped down toward a dark pocket of scrub. He had to set the ship down short. It would not return to base. Calder's recorded voice continued to list names while the ground shook and the team fought. Malik's ship hit the scrub hard. The pilot's warning siren sputtered out. The convoy was semi-immobilized, the ambush working, but every success took a toll. Jeremir's shoulder bled. His rifle clattered out of reach. He pulled himself low, taste metallic, and heard in the distance the metallic sigh of a railgun recalibrating, its coil settling back into lethal fidelity. Sarah's relay dimmed to critical levels, and the mesh began to stitch back. They had time less than it had been. Voss shouted orders and carved the retreat route with a precision that turned panic into procedure. They would not leave Malik. He was bleeding from a torn leg before he could climb from the cockpit. The field medic's bag, the one med pack, was opened and spread across a rock. There would be no full field surgery. They would stabilize. Mercy demanded triage and cold, accurate decisions. Jeremir felt himself drifting on the edge of blackness. He had a thought that was not tactical, not strategic, but raw. He had failed to protect the simple thing that had started the fight, a girl named Nayeli. His vision swam and then narrowed until only Voss's eyes and Malik's shout remained bright. Calder's testimony was being recorded, the legal leverage accumulating like a brittle ledger. The convoy's lead truck smoked, but it was still a truck with men who could walk. The price of survival was not free. Before the world tilted again, Voss crouched near him, hands quick, and applied a field bandage. "Hold," she said. The order was soft and brutal. Her jaw was white. "We move on 3. The team rallied, a motley of quiet courage and mechanical will. Murmurs of prayer passed through the canyon like small private alarms. Jeremiah inhaled, tasted blood and dust, and held onto a single abiding resolve. Whatever the final cost, whatever pull the enemy would make in the last hour, they would not leave Calder's testimony unspoken. They would not surrender the captured logistics, and they would extract Nayeli at any cost. The win would be bought with discipline and sacrifice. That was the doctrine Jeremir had lived by. He felt the canyon's mouth breathe and knew the decisive moment was near. Shadow fell across them, something vast descending from the ridge where the sentinel rearmed. The railgun sound came back, a low, terrible hum that threaded through the team like a warning. The cliff edge above them fractured with movement, the sentinel's cage of protection locking into a new configuration. The final phase had begun, and nothing soft remained in the air. The canyon exhaled a long, tense silence as dawn broke in pale streaks across the jagged walls. Jeremiah felt every scar, every twinge from the previous night, but there was no time for pain. The final push was upon them. The red circle's sentinel railgun hummed above. The convoys had regrouped, and reinforcements from the ridge poured down into choke points with precision. Every move they had made so far had been leading to this discipline, coordination, and sacrifice would decide survival. Nothing else. Nayeli stayed close, her small frame pressed to his side, eyes scanning every shadow. She had learned quickly. Instinct had been honed by fear, patience, and rapid coaching under relentless conditions. Jeremiah had trained her to anticipate, to read patterns, and to exploit them. Now it was no longer practice. Now it was life or death. He whispered, "Stay low, follow my lead. Every step counts." She nodded, grip tightening on his forearm. The quiet courage of the young, tempered by raw determination. Voss had taken position behind a rocky overhang, coordinating the strike team while keeping Calder secure. Sarah's U-rig was humming at near capacity, feeding false thermal signatures and ghost packets into the red circle's mesh. The mesh was attempting to recalibrate, but her manipulations had created gaps, just enough to thread their escape. Malik's VTOL had been hastily patched, its decoy plumes ready for one final diversion. Every variable had been accounted for, yet every calculation left room for error. The canyon allowed no margin. Jeremiah took the lead, setting microcharges along a narrow path that ran beneath the sentinel's line of sight. This was not meant to destroy, but to create a controlled hazard, small collapses, dust clouds, and sudden noise that would force scouts to reposition, buying the team milliseconds. Timing was critical. He checked his ammo, reloaded rifle and pistol, and tested the tension in the charges. Nayeli mirrored his actions silently, her hands steady despite exhaustion. The first phase of the final assault began. Jeremiah triggered a small collapse beneath a scout patrol. The stones tumbled with a controlled cascade, drawing the red circle's eyes upward and away from the ridge. Malik's VTOL flared its decoy smoke, drawing the sentinel's attention eastward. Sarah's relay hummed, feeding contradictory thermal readings to the mesh. The red circle responded instantly, but their over-reliance on linear processing and predictable countermeasures created exploitable chaos. Jeremiah seized the opening. He and Nayeli darted through the dust-clouded corridor, using boulders and shadow to remain concealed. The scouts tried to regain formation, but the terrain, compounded by Sarah's interference, fragmented their coordination. Two patrols collided, shouting orders into broken comms, and the lieutenant who had survived the ambush froze momentarily, unsure which signal to follow. Voss moved with ruthless efficiency. She secured Calder, reading his eyes for any hesitation, any sign of renewed compliance with the red circle. He flinched under the controlled authority, and she kept him moving, channeling him toward the extraction corridor while maintaining full situational awareness. Each step was choreographed, precise, executed under pressure. The convoy's lead vehicle loomed ahead, partially immobilized from the prior ambush. Jeremiah needed to ensure that the remaining tracks would not block their retreat. He planted the final microcharge in a strategic seam of rock near the canyon's natural funnel. It would create a controlled landslide if triggered at the right moment, closing off the corridor temporarily without risking civilian or friendly life. The calculus was precise, enough to hinder pursuit, not enough to destroy. Suddenly, a sniper's shot cracked through the canyon. Jeremiah felt it graze his side, pain blooming sharp and immediate. He stumbled, but Nayeli grabbed his pack, anchoring him. The scout's optics were tracking the shimmer of motion. With a quick roll, he flattened behind a jagged boulder and returned fire, his shot hitting the rock beside the sniper. A cloud of dust erupted, masking their continued movement. Timing, instinct, and controlled aggression were their weapons now. Malik's VTO dove low, the decoy plume blooming like a false sun. The sentinel's coils adjusted, firing an arc that passed harmlessly over the team. The distraction bought them the crucial seconds to reach the canyon's upper corridor, where extraction was possible. Every breath felt measured, every heartbeat a metronome counting down their survival window. As they ascended the final ridge, the red circle attempted a last desperate flanking maneuver. Two squads moved up the opposing slope, intending to pin them in a narrow ledge. Jeremiah analyzed the terrain instantly, noting a minor fold, a natural alcove shielded by overhanging rock. He directed Nayeli and Calder into it, keeping them hidden while he prepared to confront the flanking squads. It was a calculated risk. Delay them just long enough, and the extraction point would be clear. He engaged with precision. Using controlled suppressive fire and carefully timed detonations, he forced the flanking squads to hesitate and reassess. Every shot was measured, every movement deliberate. The scouts tried to advance, but the canyon's folds worked against them. Dust shadows and sound manipulation created uncertainty in their ranks. The assault was not about destruction. It was about creating opportunity. Voss's voice came over the comm, sharp and authoritative. Jeremiah, corridor clear. Move. They sprinted the final few meters, hearts hammering. The extraction point, a concealed hollow with a rope ladder rigged to a cliffside lift, was their gateway out. Mullick's patched VTOL hovered nearby, its engines whining under stress. Ready to ferry them to a safe zone beyond the canyon, they climbed rapidly. Each movement weighted with exhaustion, yet propelled by necessity. Nayeli was first, followed by Calder under Voss's watchful eye, then Jeremiah, feeling every muscle protest. Behind them, the red circle was still regrouping, but the combined effects of tactical deception, terrain manipulation, and precise timing had neutralized their immediate threat. Mullick's VTO dipped to take Jeremiah aboard, and the engine surged. Sarah's EJU relay continued feeding false thermal signatures to the canyon, masking the retreat. The team moved in perfect synchronization, discipline, coordination, and sacrifice, achieving what brute force alone could not dot as the lift ascended. The canyon floor dropping away beneath them, Jeremiah allowed himself a fleeting glance back. The red circle remained, regrouping, but they had been outmaneuvered at every turn. The cost had been high injuries, strain, and a fractured alliance, but the core objective had been achieved. Calder was secured, the logistics disruption was complete, and Nayeli had survived, shielded by relentless strategy and the bond forged in adversity. Mullick's VTO rose above the canyon rim, engines straining but effective. Jeremiah pressed Nayeli close, feeling the tremor in her hands and the exhaustion in his own. Voss monitored every movement, her eyes sharp for potential threats even in extraction. Sarah maintained the EW cover feed-in. The canyon finally receded behind them. Dust, rock, and the ghosts of combat fell away into distance. The team exhaled as a unit, the collective weight of tension and responsibility loosening, but not vanishing. Each member bore scars, both visible and invisible. Lessons had been learned about trust, improvisation, and the cost of tactical advantage. Discipline and coordination had carried them through, as had mercy and ethical decision-making under fire. In the aftermath, Calder's testimony would unravel networks and expose supply chains. Mullick's VTOL, patched but functional, had ensured they had not lost a single team member. Sarah's manipulations of the mesh had preserved lives and disrupted enemy operations without unnecessary destruction. Nayeli had survived, her courage and adaptability proving decisive. Jeremiah reflected on the canyon's trial, the orchestration of human and technological assets, and the precise calculus of survival. The canyon lay behind them, jagged and silent, a crucible where strategy, patience, and sacrifice had been tested to the limit. They had emerged victorious, but tempered, reminded that victory came at a price, and that human grit, ingenuity, and relentless coordination were worth more than brute force. They had acted as a unit, as a system, as a single organism functioning under pressure, and in that discipline lay the endearing lesson of the campaign. To survive and prevail, one needed more than firepower. One needed clarity, courage, and the willingness to sacrifice for the collective good. Jeremiah held Nayeli's hand as the VTOL carried them away. He looked down at the canyon fading beneath them, knowing that while the battle had ended, the doctrine they had created of precision, improvisation, and ethical action under pressure would endure. The cost had been high, but the outcome had been decisive. They had won not because of luck, not because of chance, but because of careful calculation, human resolve, and the relentless execution of every plan to its full potential. The canyon's walls glimmered in the morning light, silent witnesses to the campaign that had tested every principle of strategy and humanity. Jeremiah's heart slowed, but his mind remained sharp, cataloging every lesson learned, every hazard exploited, every life spared or preserved. They had survived, yes, but they had also defined the standards by which survival could be won with discipline, coordination, and sacrifice. And in that realization lay the enduring truth: The battlefield was never simply about who had more numbers, more weapons, or more firepower. It was about who had the vision, the patience, and the courage to execute with precision when every second mattered. And as the VTOL ascended toward open skies, leaving the canyon behind, Jeremiah allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had endured, they had triumphed, and the doctrine forged in the crucible of the canyon would shape every operation yet to come. They had won through skill, intelligence, and unwavering determination, and that victory, unlike any bullet or explosive, was permanent.